particularly in such a volatile market. Like, let's take the flash crash, right? The thing that happened. Let's look at XRP. The thing that happened earlier this month, right, when all the alts just fucking puked. With ice, if you had an isolated leverage position here, you can only lose the margin of the position. If you had cross and the sites go down and the sites are lagging or whatever, and you're on cross, then you could lose your whole account instead of just the position. Does that make sense? And you know, there's plenty of instances where quote unquote skipped stop losses. So isolated leverage ultimately is a really good tool to use for protection. And then you can actually you can go one step further than that in the event that how much leverage should you use. It depends. If it's internalized market making system for the perpetuals on an exchange, then the liquidity is pretty static. And if the liquidity is static, then you need to look at the closest bid-ask depth of liquidity. So, like, let's say, if you wanted to market order 100x long, the closest order is like 10 Bitcoin or something. And if you wanted to market sell 100x long, the closest bid is 10 Bitcoin. If your total position size is less than 10 Bitcoin, leverage, including leverage, so after you use leverage, if it's less than 10 Bitcoin, then you can use higher leverage to use less position size, less position margin. Basically, like, you can get your... So say this is like the position, right? You have a stop loss. You can get your isolated liquidation closer to the stop loss. So meaning you would use higher leverage in order to mitigate the risk of like the flash crash happening where you're only losing the position margin. And so that's advantageous as long as there's enough liquidity. So if it's an internalized market making system, which a lot of exchanges have for their perpetual contracts, then you just look at the average liquidity. Like I said, let's say it's 10 Bitcoin. If your position size is less than 10 Bitcoin, then you can bleed up you can raise the leverage to get your isolated liquidation closer and closer to the stop loss in order to mitigate pretty much all of the slippage risk. Nobody ever fucking talks about this on the internet. That's why SKS is telling me to stop talking about it. And it might be hard for you to understand what the fuck I just said, but most of the time it's not a big deal. You don't really need to understand all this. It's just for very rare moments like this where this shit happens. And you would lose slightly less on an isolated liquidation than you would if not. I'll try and explain it in a simple fashion, okay? So, isolated leverage equals you can only lose position margin, right? You can't lose the whole account with isolated leverage. You can only lose whatever margin you put in for the position, right? We all agree with that, right? With cross leverage, if you don't have a stop loss, you can liquidate the whole account. That's the difference. Okay, and then so how much leverage should you use? Well, it doesn't, most of the time it doesn't really matter how much leverage you use unless you want to get really fancy with it. And it's not a fixed number, it would be dynamic depending on how wide your stop loss is. But your position sizing is always determined by the distance between your entry to the distance between your stop loss. That's what determines your position, not how much leverage you use. Okay, you guys understand that? That's kind of a hard concept to grasp. So position size always is determined difference of entry to stop. Okay. Next, we need to evaluate internalized market making systems. Whether it's internal or external, it's usually pretty obvious if it's internal or external. It'll be a lot. It'll be pretty fucking high. Right? So like if the average bid so like you're looking at the perpetual book on whatever exchange you're using, and you're looking at the order book, right? So like the closest orders to the current price. Let's say it's 10 Bitcoin if you want to market smash sell for like a 1 cent spread or a $1 spread, or 10 Bitcoin on the other side. So if order book depth at minimal spread is greater than or equal to position total position total position in when you factor in this is the total position size when you're also factoring in leverage. So not the position margin, but the position size after you've already multiplied it by the leverage. Then isolated liquidation level can be as close to stop loss as possible. Okay, make sure that the exchange you're using is pretty fair about this stuff. Some of them, I don't know, depends. So then isolated liquidation level can be closer. I'm not gonna say as close as possible. I'm just gonna say closer. So basically, if this is your stop loss here, right? Okay, and you have a 10 Bitcoin position, so like $1 million position, after you've done the leverage, after you've tagged in the leverage. It means that, and the book, right? So like, so like here, right? The books here. If the average bid is greater than or equal to 10 Bitcoin, and the average ask, like the closest one with the least amount of spread, is greater than or equal to 10 Bitcoin or your position size, then you don't have to worry about your liquidation getting hit because of slippage. Your stop loss should get hit at the price you want it to get hit at without slippage. So like, if there's 10 Bitcoin here willing to be bought and you're trying to exit with 10 Bitcoin, then you would get hit exactly at your stop loss. Right? So that means that what you can do is you can raise your leverage. Now, why would you raise your leverage? In the event that there's a flash crash, if you have higher leverage, that means your position margin is lower. If you're using more leverage, you're still getting to the same position size, but the amount of money that you put into the position margin or the risk into the margin is lower. That way, if all the orders evaporate in the book, which they did, all the orders evaporate in the book, you're only liable to lose your position margin. And if you tweak the number up, the leverage as high as you can to get the lowest amount of position margin, then you've mitigated even more risk. Again, most of the time you don't have to worry about this kind of stuff. This is kind of going in depth, but one of the reasons why, isolated leverage is so good is because if all the market makers, if Binance goes down and all the market makers, can't reduce positions and all the books are lifted, then it's a free-for-all on FIFO and you're going to pay a fuck ton of slippage. In fact, if you got cross leverage with no stop loss in a situation like that, your account is donezo. And that happened to a lot of people. But if you're using 2x leverage and you're also using isolated, so you feel pretty good about it, right? Only 2x leverage and you're using isolated, that same occurrence can fuck you pretty fucking hard. if the stop loss gets skipped, if the books get lifted, then it would actually be advantageous to use higher leverage. That way it's less of position margin at risk. As long as it fits into your rules, right? So like, let's imagine that the distance between the entry and the stop loss is 1%. Then you would want to use like 50x leverage, because your stop loss should get triggered, so you're not going to get isolated you're not going to get liquidated anyways. But if you use, so if the distance between your entry and your stop loss is 1%, and you're using 50x leverage versus using 2x leverage. If you're using 2x leverage, you got to use a lot of margin to get to the position size that fits your risk profile. If you use 50x, you got to use way less margin to get to that same position size. And you're still assuming that you'll get stopped out at your stop loss regardless of the leverage you use. So you don't have to worry about the liquidation, except for that rare time that the market makers all go offline pretty much. And now you've got huge exposure on a position size because your stop loss isn't getting triggered and it's going to go for your liquidation. And some alts went down 50%. So it's kind of important because you don't know when these sort of black swan events are going to happen. And you want to put the risk back onto the exchange. If the exchange is offering you isolated leverage, that means they're offering to take the slippage risk from you. The last key thing that you need to pay attention to is the order book dynamics. If it's constant deep liquidity relative to your position size, then you're fine. You want to give a little bit of a buffer, right? You don't want to have the isolated liquidation like $1 lower than the stop loss. Like, give yourself a little bit of buffer, but you know, you can tighten the buffer, I guess. And in fact, a lot of the, you guys know how I mentioned like the smaller scale market making. So a lot of the smaller scale market makers got fucking dusted when the flash crash happened, because they were arbitraging the difference in price between the spot markets and the perpetual markets. If they had built isolated leverage into their models instead of using cross leverage or coin margin, right? Coin margin, cross leverage, then they actually would have survived it with not that big of a drawdown. But they never assumed that, you know, they couldn't interact with Binance's API, right? Nobody assumes that you can't interact with the exchange's API. But if you've been around long enough in crypto, you've seen a lot of crazy shit, right? Mt. Gox, FTX, right? Crazy shit can happen. So it's not, you're not disadvantaged by mitigating as much risk as you can while still maintaining the same reward.